Russia's sovereign debt has been downgraded to junk status. The ruble is worth less than a single penny, and now fears of a looming real estate collapse are threatening to drag the entire Russian economy into deeper chaos. What was once described as a superheated war economy is now showing signs of severe strain, a financial supernova with no safety net beneath it. Policy decisions from the Kremlin leadership drove these outcomes. Vladimir Putin's choices have driven Russia's backbone industry, its multi-trillion ruble housing market, into a death spiral. The country's financial lifeline is fraying, and the logic that once guided the Kremlin's economic management is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Russian banks are rejecting loan applications by the millions, and those few who still qualify face interest rates reaching absurd heights, nearly 30% in many regions. The government's answer to this meltdown borders on the surreal, constructing new housing for buyers who don't exist, erecting empty cities to mask a bursting bubble. It's a desperate illusion meant to keep the appearance of motion, even as the entire system stalls. This crisis is not a random accident. It is an act of economic self-sabotage, born from a vicious cycle where state intervention created inflation, and inflation created insolvency. The Kremlin printed approximately 4.3 trillion rubles in a single burst, flooding the economy with devalued currency, triggering soaring prices, and forcing a choice between financial collapse and political revolt. This is the anatomy of how a needless war corrodes a nation from the inside out. To understand how Russia reached this point, we need to go back to the roots of its housing system. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the construction and housing markets became central pillars of the new Russian economy. Housing was more than just shelter. It was a symbol of progress, a practical guarantee of stability in a fragile post-Soviet landscape. A nation of 150 million people needed homes, and to build those homes, it needed workers, materials, factories, and transport. This interconnected cycle of demand generated billions of rubles in economic motion. The housing market, quite literally, served as a key growth engine. But in 2025, those gears began to seize. Insider data from the second quarter of that year revealed a devastating trend. Sales had been falling for months, culminating in a 55% drop by June. The cause of this collapse lies buried in the structure of Russia's mortgage system, a system that is unlike most others in the modern world. In Russia, the market is divided into two layers. The first-tier market represents newly built homes that have never been lived in, while the second-tier market includes previously owned or used properties. For years, first-tier units sold at approximately 40–45% higher prices than used units. That dominance deepened after 2020, when Moscow introduced a system of so-called preferential mortgages. The idea behind these mortgages was straightforward: stimulate demand by lowering the cost of borrowing. Buyers who qualified could pay an interest rate of around 6%, while the state would quietly cover the rest. Under ordinary conditions, mortgage rates in Russia ranged between 16% and 20%, but these state-backed loans artificially suppressed costs to keep the construction sector alive after the pandemic. They were available to specific groups: young families, IT professionals, defense workers, and residents of remote regions like the Arctic and Far East. But this system was far from equitable. Families still needed to make a down payment about 20–30%, a barrier that excluded Russia's poorest citizens, even though the program was marketed as a solution for them. IT workers were favored heavily, part of the Kremlin's push to retain skilled professionals in a country increasingly cut off from global technology markets. Yet the policy failed to stop the exodus. Since 2022, hundreds of thousands of Russian IT specialists have fled abroad, working remotely in exile, rather than returning home for subsidized housing. For a while, the preferential mortgage program appeared to succeed. Millions took advantage of the reduced rates, construction sites buzzed with new projects, and state media hailed the policy as proof of economic resilience. But beneath the surface, the numbers didn't add up. The cost of these subsidies was draining the treasury, and the war in Ukraine made the burden unsustainable. By 2024, the economic strain had reached a breaking point. With the invasion continuing, Russia's military spending has been reported at roughly 30% of GDP. The government began debating whether to double the citizens' share of interest payments from 6% to 12%, a move that would shatter household budgets already under siege. Banks began rejecting loan applications en masse. 4 out of 5 mortgage applications were refused, and of those approved, nearly half required borrowers to spend over 80% of their income just to stay afloat. The preferential mortgage system, initially designed to rescue the housing sector, had turned into a trap, a self-reinforcing cycle where the government tried to subsidize public debt, only to plunge deeper into its own. When the program finally ended in July 2024, demand collapsed almost overnight. Mortgage issuance in June 2025 fell by a staggering 66% compared to the same month a year earlier. For many, the end of state-backed loans was catastrophic. A typical borrower seeking 4.4 million rubles for a new apartment now faced a 20% down payment and a 30% annual interest rate, meaning they would repay about 14.6 million rubles over the life of the loan. The math alone made property ownership impossible for the average family. The housing crisis, however, wasn't caused by the mortgage system alone. It was also the direct consequence of war economics. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the government began printing money to cover its soaring expenses. By the end of that year, 4.3 trillion new rubles had been injected into circulation. Inflation skyrocketed to levels unseen since 2002. Inflation raises prices across sectors and shifts demand to hard assets. In most economies, it also dampens real activity. As prices rose across the board, real estate became both more expensive and more psychologically appealing. In times of crisis, people seek security in tangible assets, especially property. This created an artificial surge in demand, pushing prices even higher. Yet that demand was hollow, built on borrowed and devalued money. The Kremlin had created the illusion of prosperity by inflating the currency supply, while still paying billions in mortgage subsidies. It was short-term output support despite weak end buyer demand, pretending to fix one crisis by silently fueling another. Then came sanctions. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, much of the world responded with financial and tech export restrictions, which reduced credit availability and materials access. Western markets froze Russian assets, restricted technology exports, and severed ties with banks. The result was devastating. Russia's purchasing power collapsed, and foreign investment evaporated. Developers suddenly lost their funding, projects stalled, and buyers disappeared. The impact hit both sides of the supply-demand balance. On the supply side, halted projects and fleeing investors froze construction timelines. On the demand side, potential foreign buyers, those once eager to own Russian real estate, were cut off entirely. The result was a domino effect. Construction slowed, demand shrank, and property values began to wobble. By the end of 2022, capital outflow exceeded $200 billion, the largest in Russian history. That money represented not only lost investments, but also the mass flight of wealth and confidence from an economy that no longer appeared stable or safe. According to mid-2025 reports, housing construction technically fell by only 2% from January to June. On paper, that might sound minor, but it masks a far grimmer truth. Commercial real estate construction collapsed by 38%, and new housing units continued to rise despite a vanishing market. So why are developers still building? The answer exposes the system's deepest flaw. Many companies continue construction not because they expect buyers, but because they cannot afford to stop. About 7 million Russians work in construction, a sector that consumes half of the country's metal and energy output. It is also one of the few industries capable of masking unemployment. If construction halts, millions would lose their jobs overnight, risking significant labor dislocation and political pressures. Developers have been clinging to outdated installment programs, agreements where buyers pay the construction company directly, bypassing banks. These arrangements fix the property's value at the time of purchase, which means inflation eats away the developer's real profits. Still, many continue the practice, fearing that halting production would be worse than selling at a loss. Some even cling to the hope that interest rates will drop, or that the government will reintroduce preferential mortgages to reignite demand. The state, however, cannot keep bailing out the industry indefinitely. Road construction companies are already leading in wage delays and bankruptcies, as government contracts fail to adjust for inflation. The ripple effects are spreading into transportation, manufacturing, and trade. And yet, Moscow insists on maintaining the illusion of prosperity, continuing to build empty apartment blocks and large volumes of unoccupied new housing in a country where few can afford to live in them. The desperation is spreading beyond Russia's borders. The Kremlin has even announced intentions to expand construction in occupied Ukrainian territories, perhaps as a propaganda symbol of permanence. But the reality remains grim. Russia's housing market is oversupplied, underfinanced, and heading toward a cliff. Even optimistic government projections now describe 2026 as a difficult year and predict only a slow, uncertain recovery in 2027. The heart of this crisis is not just economic, it's political. Putin's war has drained Russia's budget and destabilized every pillar of its domestic economy. The same subsidies that once held up the construction sector now weigh it down. The same inflation that briefly propped up growth has now consumed it. The same leadership that promised stability is now sustaining itself on illusion. Experts warn that this crisis goes beyond real estate. The housing collapse may be the early warning sign of a broader national breakdown. If the construction bubble bursts, the shock could trigger mass bankruptcies across industries, collapsing banks, and a wave of unemployment unseen since the Soviet collapse. The fragile threads holding Russia's financial system together are fraying rapidly, and the country's leadership continues to pretend that nothing is wrong. President Putin continues to boast about rising GDP figures, as though they can mask the cracks spreading through the foundation. Roughly 30% of that GDP is now spent on the war itself, a special military operation that was once promised to last only a few days. But numbers on paper cannot feed a population. GDP growth does not ensure household welfare, and GDP cannot put a roof over your head. Behind the headlines and the propaganda, Russia's economic engine is burning itself out. One ghost city, one unpaid loan, and one false promise at a time. A severe correction appears increasingly likely. And when it does, it will not just bring down buildings. It will expose the true cost of a war that Russia can no longer afford to fight, nor to forget.